In this book, I attempt to argue that the elementary doctrine of Christ presented in Hebrews 6:1-2 refers to an apostolic era initiation, like a catechism into Jesus' school of disciples. Entering the club involved a series of beliefs the new initiate must confess, and rites the new initiate must undergo. These rites of passage seem to be summarized as follows: a foundation of repentance from dead works and faith toward God, and of instruction about washings, the laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and eternal judgment. Hebrews 6:1-2. The 6 institutions that comprise the elementary doctrine of Christ in Hebrews 6:1-2 were the basics that the apostles and early believers taught to new disciples of Jesus. In that regard, the list can be read as essential prerequisite doctrines and practices incumbent upon the new believer. The value of understanding the elementary principles should be self-evident. For the most part, the books of the New Testament assume that the reader is already a believer and therefore has already accepted the elementary doctrines, whatever they might be. For that reason, the New Testament does not bother introducing these foundational teachings, and one is left to discern the basics by inference. Even when the writer of the book of Hebrews lays out this list of basics, he does so only incidentally and without discussion. This book attempts to provide the definition of each elementary doctrine as well as discussion about each one. Christian tradition provides its own catechisms and its own definitions for each of these elementary doctrines. But in this book, I am interested in discovering how these basics of the faith would have been understood before Christianity left the Jewish matrix and evolved into a primarily Gentile religion. In other words, I want to know the elementary doctrine of Christ as the apostles themselves would have understood it within Judaism. This seems to me to be especially important when considering a text from the Epistle to the Hebrews, a word of exhortation written by a Jewish believer and addressed to Jewish believers. Unlike the epistles of Paul, the book of Hebrews assumes a Jewish readership. I first presented the contents of this book as Sabbath teachings at the Messianic Jewish congregation Beth Emanuel Sabbath Fellowship in Hudson, Wisconsin, in the year 2013. This printed edition contains several revisions and expansions to the material, but as in the original addresses, the teachings assume a readership already familiar with the theory of Messianic Judaism and the Jewish approach to Christianity. This is a book about Messianic Jewish reading of the New Testament, Christianity, and the Gospel. Messianic Judaism starts with the assumption that Christianity was originally Jewish. Jesus, the apostles, and all the first disciples were practicing Jews, who considered themselves part of Israel and the Jewish people. They did not envision themselves as the authors of a new religion. They considered themselves to be a sect within greater Judaism, a Reformation movement inspired by the teachings of Jesus, Yeshua of Nazareth, and by their conviction that he is the long-promised Messiah King. They belonged to the sect of the Nazarene, a first-century Jewish school of discipleship centered around Yeshua. They did not hold Jesus or the gospel message in antithesis to the law, the Torah of Moses. They upheld the words of Jesus. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not one dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:17-19. Messianic Judaism is a branch of Judaism that honors Yeshua of Nazareth as Messiah and the divine Son of God. The modern Messianic Jewish movement was born from Christian missionary efforts to evangelize Jews. In the late 19th century, Jewish believers in Jesus began to take ownership of their faith, eschewing Gentile Christian modes of worship and interpretation, and to establish an authentic Jewish expression of the faith. In the 1960s and 1970s, the movement blossomed in the United States among young Jewish Christians of the baby boom generation. Since then, it has outgrown its original chrysalis as a Jewish missionary effort and has begun to emerge as an independent sect of Judaism, much as the communities of the original apostles did.